Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We have people logging in from across the globe. Thank you so much for joining this session hosted by Bero. My name is Shakti Prasad. I'm the head of content at Bero, and I run the Procurement Espresso magazine. I welcome you all to the 11th edition of Espresso Live event, an online thought leadership forum featuring procurement leaders and practitioners. Before I get started with the session, just a few housekeeping rules to be kept in mind. All the participants will be on listen-only mode for the entire duration of the webinar. We will take up the questions at the end of the presentation, but we would encourage our attendees to key in their questions anytime during the session. You can type them into the question box given in your control panel. As you know, today we're going to talk about maximizing value delivery beyond savings, about this program called Procurement Engine. So if you have any questions around that, or any questions based on your personal challenges, operational challenges that you're facing in a day-to-day job, you can feel free to ask Sebastien, and I'm sure he will have some word of advice or ideas for you. Anyway, so there could be a lag of few seconds in between the transition of slides, so please bear with us. And if you have any difficulty in joining the webinar, please try to log back in or key in your queries in the Q&A box, and we will try to help you. If you are not able to hear the audio or if the video is not clear, please try to close the application, then log back in. Hopefully it should work. Now, I am happy to introduce Sebastien Bals, the Chief Procurement Officer at Belgian Pharma Major, UCB. I hope you all can see him on your screens. Hi, Sebastien. The companies, that is UCB's medicines, help people living with severe diseases in immunology and neurology. Procurement function headed by Sebastien plays an important role in achieving company objectives around addressing the needs of the patients. So it's a very key role that they play, like all of you play at your respective organizations. So today, as I said earlier, we're going to be discussing a novel program designed by Sebastien. The program is known as Procurement Engine, whose aim is to maximize value delivery beyond savings. I know it sounds like some advertorial, but no, that this is an actual program. It was implemented, tried and tested, and Sebastien will talk about it shortly. But the aim of it's not just that. We will also discuss how such programs can help the sourcing teams in being prepared for any supply disruptions. So we will touch upon that also in depth. So it's imperative for procurement teams to indulge in systemic thinking, in creating new programs and operating models that would eventually help business in achieving its goals. So Sebastien, thanks once again for joining today's session.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sebastien. So let's move on. Next slide, please. Yes. So Sebastien, what is Procurement Engine in simple terms? And if someone would ask you what it is as an elevator pitch, what would you tell them?
Well, the Procurement Engine is actually our procurement operating model that is enabling our UCB procurement team to, on one hand, lead sustainable procurement at UCB, but also to deliver value beyond traditional sourcing, and by enabling us to be trusted partners for, on one hand, our UCB colleagues, but also our partners and suppliers out there. Now, of course, the reason why we've called it an engine, or why we're making the analogy with an engine, is actually driven by the fact that, similar to an engine, our operating model consists of different parts. And in order to perform well, each part, on one hand, is equally important, but also needs to work in sync in order to enable maximum performance. And again, as you will see, it allows us also to really catch up to all these changes and make sure that we continuously perform well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a nice introduction, Sebastien. So can we move on? Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit of backstory, Sebastian. What prompted you to devise this program? What are the circumstances that led you to devise this program? Of course, it is kind of helping you now. So something must have happened in the past for you to come up with this idea and implement it.
Yeah, so actually we have every time we have 3-year strategic cycles, so we call them at UCB. And so back in 2018, we were defining what the next 3 years and beyond, of course, would look like. But we were coming to the end of a cycle. And then that's also the time that we traditionally start looking at the environment, both internally as well as externally, to see what was changed and how this would affect us as procurement, but also what that would mean for us as procurement superheroes moving forward. And it was of course clear that we were facing a war for talent, and that the world in which we were operating at that point in time, even though that was way before we had the pandemic, that it was rapidly changing. I mean, we realized that there were new standards that were being created, which would require to challenge how we work as a procurement department if we wanted to stay relevant in the long run. Like, for example, we looked carefully at how technology and robotics could potentially disrupt procurement, or at least disrupt how we buy certain things. But then also, we also recognized that there were a number of these disruptive innovations that were going on in the world around us, which would not only change how we buy things, but also what we buy. And again, although that we're surrounded by procurement superheroes, it was really a question as to whether or not we had the right competencies and capabilities within procurement. We were at that point in time mainly traditionally organized, I would say. And if you looked at our job descriptions, we were probably looking for those jack of all trades, whereby we looked for people who are good at supplier relationship management, good at negotiations, good at analytics, good at supply market intelligence, and all these types of things. But as the saying goes, a jack of all trades is also a master of none. And so we actually asked our team, and as a leadership team, we asked a question about, so if we think about the competencies that we would be needing in the future, what would those be? And what we realized is that we clearly had to evolve our model if we wanted to, on one hand, continue to create impact, but also start delivering these value beyond savings. Traditionally you would operate like what I call a capacity-based model, which means that the more capacity, meaning the more people or headcount you would pour into the organization, the more impact you would create. But we really were convinced that if we want to stay relevant towards the future, we needed to evolve towards a competency model, and really to also not only look at competencies, but also to build on this complementarity as a team, which is similar to a sports team. We don't believe that procurement should operate as one single person. Procurement should operate as a sports team where everybody has a specific role and they have a joint ambition to win together by collaborating and playing out their different parts. And so we try to translate that into the organizational setup. Of course, recognizing that everybody's unique and that everybody's got a talent, but really make sure that we moved away from that traditional notion, I would say.
Yeah. In fact, talent is very important. When you touched upon it, of course, this program had some significant impact on the way your team is structured. We will be touching upon that very soon. But before moving on, Sebastian, see, you've been in a pharma company. I know your company focuses on a specific therapeutic areas, immunology, etc. But did you have any inkling of a global pandemic that was about to hit? 2018, you grew, you all met and figured out, okay, you need a new strategic push. Was there any inkling that, okay, there's going to be a global pandemic that's going to completely upend the ways of working and the way we think?
So there's no mean, of course, we didn't have a crystal ball. We weren't foreseeing what was to come. I still recall that even in January of 2020, we were still having conversations. I was planning a trip to China with part of the team, and we were planning our annual procurement conference and seeing how we would invite our Chinese and Asian colleagues as a whole. And you know, nobody was seeing that. But you know, there was one picture which I once saw, which was very telling for me, and that's a bridge that was built in Honduras to basically withstand hurricanes. Because during the 90s, a lot of the infrastructure in the country was basically destroyed due to hurricanes, and here they built this incredibly strong hurricane-proof bridge. But actually, it withstood the hurricanes that came after. But what the hurricanes also did is that they rerouted the river around the bridge, making the bridge pretty much useless. So that's also what triggered for me saying, you know, I mean, I don't care how strong or how performant of an organization that I might have today. I need to continuously be mindful that there might be things going on either within the company or externally that need me to prepare better and not be maybe as strong and as robust at that bridge, but maybe be a bit more flexible and agile like the river passing by it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. The river changing its course, making the bridge, rendering the bridge useless. I think it's a very powerful imagery that you have narrated here, Sebastien. I mean, that's precisely what happened, right? I mean, we were all secure in our own plans, and then the pandemic hit. I mean, it completely changed all the equations. I mean, that's great. I think we stayed on this slide for a bit too long. Can we move on, please? Yes. So I know that you spoke about some of the aims, of this program during our preliminary conversation a couple of weeks ago. So of course, there are many catchwords and keywords that are there on the slide deck. So what are some of the main aims and how it was structured to address the need?
Yeah, so I mean, I've already touched upon the evolution moving from a capacity to a competency-based model. I think that has been extremely relevant for us, especially because it enabled us to deliver on what we call our procurement value offering. And what I mean with the value offering is that we've created basically a service model whereby we are delivering different types of services to the organization beyond traditional sourcing. And so if we wanted to deliver on all these services that we had identified, it was clear that we needed different type of competencies in the organization. I think a second one for us was we were seeking efficiency gains. We wanted to become more efficient. And so basically we realized that how we were organized, whether it was from a hierarchical point of view or from a regional point of view or a category point of view, is that we were operating quite silo driven. I mean, you had categories with buyers in it, and you would have countries with buyers in it, which basically prevented us from really allocating the resources there where the business needs them, and so really in alignment with business priorities. And it's not because we have a specific marketing spend that the urgency or the need from a strategic point of view isn't that, but also from a hierarchical point of view, it's really testing the waters with self-governing teams, not having hierarchical lines for everything in place. And then I think a second thing that we've also changed is this notion of category. For example, what we've done is we've moved towards spend journeys. And what we call a spend journey is, I mean, you could traditionally compare it to a category, but what we wanted to achieve is a different kind of thinking of the individuals in that particular role. So for example, instead of looking at an HR category and looking at recruiting in isolation or training in isolation or all these types of things, what we thought is let's think about the hire to retire process as a whole and the experience that employees, for example, are going through. And then how does that translate into spend allocated across the globe? So really stimulating our teams to think differently, and also then, I mean, connect better into the organization to ultimately, like I said, become a trusted advisor. I think the last thing that really was a key aim is this concept of self-service and technology. I mean, I'm a firm believer that if companies do not leverage technology which is out there for procurement purposes, so no longer procurement technology to make procurement departments more efficient, but actually procurement or technology to make procurement departments obsolete for some of the activities that we used to do, is going to be a very huge enabler or catalyst, which will allow us to really deliver this value beyond savings.
Yeah, that's correct. So moving on, Sebastien, of course, we spoke about personal changes and war for talent that you had experienced, back then. So this program you had mentioned had impact on the team setup, and there were 6 distinct roles that were created in order to run this engine efficiently. Like you had mentioned, the sporting analogy, everyone has a specific role to play. So can you elaborate on these roles and what kind of competency that they bring to the table?
So, although that in an ideal world, we would go with everybody's individual talents, but of course, in an organization, it's very hard. It would be quite chaotic if everybody would just figure out what he or she likes doing and then excel at that. So we needed to group certain things in roles. And to a certain extent, the way we defined the roles, we got inspired a bit by a consultancy company and how they organized themselves. I think the first important thing is that we've made a clear split in terms of sourcing, whether it's strategic or tactical sourcing, and call it the category management type of activities from before. So we've created this role of sourcing managers, which is, pretty much one of the core roles that we still have within our organization. And those are the people who are performing and delivering sourcing support both towards the business, but also internally within procurement. Because, for example, the spend journey leads, they don't do any sourcing anymore. So, for example, if they need sourcing support in order to deliver on their strategy, or they would need sourcing support, for example, to define, let's say, a preferred supplier list or those types of things, they will actually have to submit a project like our stakeholders to get basically sourcing support. And depending on where the priorities lie, we will allocate resources to them. A second split that we've made was our center of excellence. We've clearly made a split between, on one hand, what is our core foundational, call it backbone, which needs to be performing very well, so our source to pay process. And so we've put these source to pay catalysts there, supported by our outsourced partners there as well. But then, in order to deliver on the other services lines that we had identified, we've created these value catalysts, which are basically the ones who are strengthening and building and marketing these new service lines, again, both towards our procurement colleagues as well as the business. Now, there's one role in particular which I would like to highlight, which is that of a people development lead. And the reason I want to focus a bit on that is very simply because if you operate a competency-based model, then developing competencies are really important. So what we realize is that very often these competency or these development discussions were either not taking place consistently, or they were taking place like maybe once or twice a year during like a performance evaluation and all that. And that many of the one-to-ones that the managers were having with their direct reports were focused far more on operational type of activities. And so what we really wanted to do is we wanted to bring diversity and equity into that development conversation. And so that's why we created this role of a people development lead, which is to a certain extent, on one hand, a mentor, he or she's a coach, that is really dedicated to the development and the career of those of the people in the team. And so, of course, it's not a standalone role. So this is people who are passionate about developing others, and that can be unrelated to the hierarchy you have within the organization, but really driven by your passion and your ambition. It's an additional role that we have, and you know, I think this has been very well received within the organization.
Oh, that's great. In fact, Sebastien, you know, of these 6 roles, you know, you mentioned people lead, but what caught my attention is this procurement value catalyst. You know, introducing new procurement value offerings beyond sourcing. So, can you elaborate on that? Because this is the area that perhaps you know, the function is moving ahead. Normal sourcing, purchasing. Okay, let me launch an RFP, shortlist a supplier, and then go ahead and, you know, sign a contract. So this perhaps is looking beyond that, right? So can you throw some light on that role?
I mean, for example, many of the COEs that we have actually develop or create a lot of value. The only thing is that what they do is they create that value for procurement departments only. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to first of all create a platform where we could expand on the values that were delivered, but also to market those values directly to the internal stakeholders within the organization. I mean, a very obvious one is, for example, sustainability. Sustainability is one of the parts which is managed through the value catalyst, which is really, I mean, making sure that we define what sustainable procurement looks like for UCB and ensure that we support the organization with becoming more sustainable. And this does not necessarily happen through sourcing or sourcing activities. Yes, there's an element which the spend journey leads will incorporate in their strategies. Yes, sourcing managers will ensure that we have sustainability as part of their scope. But for example, it's looking at how diverse suppliers could help a specific area of the business address certain types of challenges that they are facing. Another one is, for example, analytics. And again, here we are moving away from traditional, call it spend data or spend analysis, where you can really leverage that, but really talking about procurement insights. So using, on one hand, I mean, traditional data, but really also advancing more with advanced analytics to provide true insights to the organization by connecting data sources which are not necessarily purely procurement data sources, but could be other data sources, both internally as well as externally within the organization. One which is again more recent is, I mean, we have significantly expanded our risk management offering. And really to create an overall competency within the organization around risk management. So this is really where we are creating that platform. And again, some of these service lines, they work, others don't, and they get adjusted or fine-tuned or potentially stopped if that is relevant. But it's really seeing, looking at where there's a niche that we could address through our competencies or experiences, where we have a license to play, or we can have a license to play, and really developing them beyond.
Okay, so you mentioned you know, specialized roles like analyzing data, identifying patterns, and then presenting the findings. So it's not a typical, you know, sourcing job description. If we rewind 5-10 years back, it won't fit into the job description, right? So do you recruit, say, people with those skill sets, say like data, people graduating from data science into those roles, or do you train your own you know, team members to take up that role if so they are interested?
So there's a combination of, but we need to be also realistic. I mean, I can send somebody through an analytics course, but that will not make that person a data scientist. And I think this is where we need to be very. I can improve the analytical skills of somebody, but can I really redevelop or reskill that person to become something differently? And that's also why we have taken the approach to do both. But for these new value catalyst roles, many of those people do not have a traditional procurement background or have even never worked in procurement, but just have rolled into it. Because what we were looking for was not a traditional procurement profile. That being said, we also have in the catalysts people who, for example, held a spend journey position before or a sourcing manager position before, have shown interest and who we have developed into these new areas. But we need to be realistic that for certain types of skills, they just can't be. We can't reskill our organization only, and we will have to acquire new skills coming into the organization if we truly want to create value from that and not just add it as an additional offering, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, because data science is a very hot course, I would say, and people who are qualified in it, they're much sought after across industries. So the people whom you recruit, do you actually sensitize them about procurement? Do you actually give them a training, maybe a crash course on what sourcing is, what it does, so that they can orient their thinking to give outputs that is of relevance to you?
So in the onboarding, yes, but we also need to be careful is that we need to leverage the diversity that these people bring to the team. We don't necessarily want them to think as procurement professionals, but we want them
Okay.
to think differently, because that's where the value comes in. I mean, we have been looking at it from through our glasses and our lenses for so many years that now we bring somebody in who is totally different. We used to have, for example, somebody who was working in the sustainability area who had a background coming from an NGO, and again had no necessarily, I mean, procurement related background when you want to come into that niche, because then you start thinking about sustainability as a procurement professional. What I want is I want somebody who is passionate and purpose driven on sustainability, who can challenge us in procurement to do more and to do things differently on a daily basis. And so these are the types of profiles that you want to get. So yes, you need to, of course, expose them to what procurement does, but also we need to leverage, I mean, their diversity that they bring. One of the things that we are now doing is we started a graduate development program whereby we are bringing in young talent into the organization, rotating them over an 18-month basis through different parts of the organization to really expose them to both areas within sourcing on the direct side, on the indirect side, but also these new areas that we define. And again, these are people who come straight out of school, who have no procurement background, but who are passionate to make a difference. And then we hope that through this experience, they can see where their interest lies, and potentially it can be in the catalyst role or in another role.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Sebastian. Thanks for your elaborate explanations on this one. Can we move on? Next slide, please. Yeah, so we touched upon this earlier also, how this this program or having such programs in place uh, helps procurement teams to navigate supply challenges whenever they occur. Of course, what happened a couple of years ago is once in a century pandemic, but it does help. So how did this help you prepare in the ensuing supply challenges? And did you receive any pat on the back, from your colleagues, like, hey, actually you did the right thing because you put this in place and it kind of helped us weather the storm, so to speak?
So I don't think that it would be fair to state that any company was prepared for what was to come. I think very few companies were actually prepared, but I do see how our model and actually having the advantage of having implemented ahead of the pandemic allowed us to be much more agile and resilient. Again, what I've mentioned before is We operate a model whereby we allocate our resources there where business priorities lie. And so it was very easy for us, because we don't have necessarily specialists only in like a marketing category or only in a supply chain category, but that we have specialists which can operate far more transversely. We were capable of plugging and playing them much more into the organization where we had the biggest priority. So, for example, in the beginning, it was maybe more around PPE. Afterwards, it's around ensuring a supply chain capacity or product capacity. And so we also were capable of even going beyond that. We were leveraging our resources to, for example, support the government in increasing testing capacity by doing procurement for the government directly. We were leveraging our teams in certain regions to help other companies even source PPE when they had challenges getting there. And whilst all this was going on, we also saw the opportunity from a service offering point of view, that there was the opportunity to really increase our supply chain visibility and supply chain risk. And so whilst you have one team who is making sure that the here and now is taken care of and that we are capable of delivering, we had other people in the organization who are working transversely with teams in supply chain and manufacturing, making sure that we implement a new digital solution to really create early warning signs capabilities in the organization to understand what was coming. Now, again, I'm not saying that in a traditional organization this would not have been possible, but I think there would be far more inertia to react to these changes. You would also probably have much more silo operations ongoing, whereby one team would be doing something and another team would also be doing something very similar, potentially, that we're not leveraging best practices or experiences, because we're just not used to operating in this far more transversal model. And so I think all in all, it has shown that this fluidity that we've created in the organization has made it much more agile and resilient to these changes. And I want to disagree with you on the fact that it might have been a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. I hope so. I mean, let's be very clear on that. The thing is, though, is that we see that crises are following up on a much faster pace. I mean, after the pandemic, we were faced with inflation to be dealt with. Then with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that we had to deal with. And what we see is that these crises are requiring us to be far more reactive and flexible to deal with these new situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are perpetually in a crisis mode. You know, we are stumbling from one crisis to the other. So absolutely. So Sebastien, you know, you're in boards of various procurement networks, and you interact with a lot of CPOs across the globe. So what's the sentiment when it comes to, say, rethinking the operating models? Have you seen a distinctive shift in the way procurement has to operate? Thereby, there is a need for recasting the teams, you know, within these large companies. Are you picking up any such signal?
Yeah, so I think many companies or many procurement organizations are dealing with the challenge about what is the perfect operating model. And again, you know, I don't think that there is one specific model that works. Potentially, if I were to be in a different organization, I would have potentially done something different than what I have implemented here, although that some of the or most of the themes would still come back, but maybe the execution of it would be different. And I think this is also what I hear when I talk to many of my colleagues. We all realize and we all acknowledge that procurement is facing some existential crises. I mean, especially 3 years ago, at the time when we were having these discussions, it was a very profound existential crisis that we had. I think nowadays, after coming out of the crisis, we see that people have changed their perception towards procurement and the relevance of procurement. But the danger is that we need to continue to stay relevant, because many of the challenges that we managed over the past couple of months, they will be taken care of in the future again. And that's how we need to make sure that we can actually continue on this journey that we're on, of becoming even more relevant and reinventing ourselves, or at least the value that we deliver, versus potentially falling back again into an existential crisis. And I think here you see that we are, and when I say we, I say most of our CPO colleagues, we are struggling to really define how to overcome that existential crisis. I think we're all in alignment that we will need to change, and that procurement will fundamentally change. I think there's different views still at how extreme that change would be. I'm probably on the very extreme side, because I feel that if I look at technology and what it can do, I mean, we are at clear risk to reinvent ourselves.
Okay, it's interesting that you said, the function continues to be in an existential crisis, so to speak, even after all that has happened. Because one thing that there is a consensus among the business stakeholders is the pandemic and the aftermath, as far as procurement is concerned, the value has only gone up. People profoundly realized the need for procurement, so much so that there are a lot of tech startups in the West Coast, who really don't think procurement. They're also now beginning to look into procurement and see what kind of value it can bring, especially in the early stages of, say, their product launch or whatever, right? So, and it's interesting that you say that even after all this, we continue to be experience some kind of existential pangs. Is it because of the rapidity of the change and the advent of what technology can do, or is it because of how the way the business is fundamentally going to be restructured, and how procurement can find a role in the restructured organization? I mean, which one is the one which you think is worrying the most?
I think I would like to add a third one.
Yeah.
And the third one is linked to our humility.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that we are far too humble as procurement organizations about the impact that we create. And of course, over the past couple of months, you couldn't open a newspaper or something was mentioned on supply chain and supply chain disruption, and people suddenly realized. But for the past 15 years, nobody spoke about procurement, or had rarely any notion about what procurement actually did or does. And I think that we are at an that we are insufficiently communicating and proud of the achievements that we do and the impact that we create, and that partially that is also driving us to get into this existential crisis, because again, we are always associated back to financial impact, like savings or working capital or the traditional measures. And again, I'm not arguing that procurement should be the ones inventing the next product, or running marketing at all. But I think what we do is really so much more than delivering on those core values. That's also why I always refer to the team as our procurement superheroes, because I truly believe that we have superpowers, and that we need to put them at use. But again, nobody really saw the real face of Superman, for example. They all know Superman, but they don't know who's behind it. And I feel that sometimes this is also what we in procurement are. They see what's going on, but they don't know who to thank for that. And I think that's going to be very important if moving forward we want to address that existential question.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned 15 years, nobody focused on supply chain. I think it was the New York Times who was recently created a exclusive beat around supply chain. And in fact, the correspondent, I think, wrote that, it's, what should have been very apparent, it was ignored for far too long. I think we're in for interesting times, Sebastien, so to speak. Okay, moving on. Next slide, please. Yeah, so, the function is, I think this ROI is like the millstone around the procurement stack. Whatever program you do, be it operating model, or even if you buy a software tool, there is always this question of ROI. Okay, what is the ROI? What is the outcome? The dollar spent, did it give any return? So I know this sounds cliche, but then I believe you do have some solid ROI and outcomes to showcase.
Again, I think, I mean, first of all, putting ROI on an organizational change is always hard, and because what's the investment that you make and what's the return that you get? Moreover, I think we need to recognize that when we did this, we didn't only do it for creating more impact for the organization, but also to create more value for the people who work within our team and really creating opportunities for them. That said, one of the most important criteria which I believe we need to think of, and what was also for us, is the spend under influence. Because again, when we influence the decisions that we do, this is when we can make a change. Again, whether it's driving financial savings, whether it is managing the risk, whether it's driving our sustainability agenda, this can only happen the more influence that we have over the spend that we manage. And so for us, that has also been one of the key returns on investment metrics that we can see. I mean, over the past couple of years, we've increased our spend under influence by about 40%. And all this by barely increasing in terms of headcount. So really by gaining the efficiencies that we had by leveraging technology or by the teams working more effectively around it. And also if you look at the performance itself and you purely look at the percentage of bottom line impact, again, if I can purely look at it from a financial point of view, we see that over just, I mean, from last year to, from 2020 to 2021, we've seen an increase of almost 15 to 20% in terms of bottom line impact that we have created. So again, financial ROI is there, but also I think what is more important, and again, we do not only want to create value for our shareholders, but also value for our planet, as well as value for the people within the organization. And there we also see that whether it's from an engagement point of view throughout the pandemic, we've really invested in trying to create a meaningful work environment for people where they can really be themselves and be at their best. And that has translated again in from an engagement point of view, and also for the planet. I mean, we've really stepped up in really making a difference both for the environment as well as the communities in which we operate. But I also I keep on hammering on this because none of this would have been possible without the team. I mean, yes, we've created a model. Yes, we've created a ways of working, but it's actually the people in the organization who have stepped out of their comfort zone. I mean, for them, for many of them, operating since or in the more traditional procurement way for many years, being open to step out of that comfort zone, operate in a new environment, take on new responsibilities, they have really made the change both in terms of stepping out of their comfort zone as well as increasing the performance, which ultimately has led or has been a significant contributor to the success of this initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of difference, right? It's a point well taken, Sebastien. So next slide, please. I think this is our last slide before we open up the Q&A, right? One more slide. Yeah. Okay, so continuous improvement is the key to any program, isn't it, Sebastien? So it's not that you implement an initiative and then forget about it. So it's kind of a living document. So what new initiatives are being done in this Procurement Engine program?
And you know, I think when you again, I want to come back to that example of that bridge, because I think that's very meaningful in the sense that whatever you build, it might be relevant at the time that you build it or that you implement it, but things will change and you need to create a certain flexibility. And you know, for us, even when you develop this, when we were talking about the roles and with the leadership team, and when we were first bringing it out into the organization, I mean, we thought we had everything nailed and thought of, and that everything would work smoothly. But guess what? I mean, you release it out in the open. There's things that do not work. There's changes that we made. I mean, for example, we started off with having one procurement team or one sourcing team for both indirect and direct. Well, that didn't work. We needed to split it up again between direct and indirect because it was too fundamentally different. And so we've had an implementation already as Procurement 2.0, what we said, which was probably even 1 year or so into the program. And now again, you know, we've entering into a new phase into the organization, and again we are asking ourselves similar questions, like for example, how well do self-governing teams work, or do we need to have more hierarchy again to a certain extent? How solid is our value offering still today, or do we need to add different values offerings, and hence should we then acquire different types of competencies, or are we going to reskill them? So all these types of things we really try to ask ourselves on a regular basis. But again, what is very important is the feedback from the bottom up. So, I mean, it's very easy from an ivory tower point of view to think that everything works, but there's a lot of things that do not work. There's inertia that you have. I mean, sometimes communication doesn't work as well as you would expect it to work. And so it's also very important that we have these feedback loops coming back from our teams, sharing what does not work, so that we can also see how we can incorporate these things into the new model. And I really would encourage all of the people who are currently listening into this call to, whatever you do, make this a fundamental part of your change. It's continuous improvement. Nothing is set in stone. Again, if you think about an engine again, because ultimately that's what we operate. I mean, after every race in Formula One, they will actually look at the performance, they will look at all the engines, and they will make an assessment, and they will make changes, and they will reuse it again into the next race, and again learn from it. Now, I'm not arguing that on a monthly basis you need to look what works and what doesn't work, but on a very regular basis you need to sit down and actually reflect on what works, what doesn't work, and be, again, humble enough to say, I might have been wrong there, or we might have been wrong there, and we need to change, and we need to course correct, take a step back, or do something more, or do something differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, Sebastien. I think it's time to open up the Q&A, audience questions. Do you have, yeah, okay. So this is the first question, Sebastien. This is from Ben Lathrop. How did the cost of the function change moving from a capacity-driven model to a competency-driven model?
So the cost itself did not change dramatically, but the allocation of the cost has changed. So where in the past we were primarily a cost, or where the cost was mainly headcount, we now see that there's a bigger difference between technology becoming a larger part of it, additional services that we buy, which we did not buy before, like, for example, to provide the analytics or the intelligence. We now need to start buying research, which we were not actively buying back in the days, or sometimes we need to buy data, which we were not buying back in the days. So what we see is that the cost of the function has, of course, grown, but that is normal due to inflation. But the biggest change has been into the allocation of the resources, and so having more shifts away from purely being or largely being driven by FTE or FTE related costs into one which is far more diverse.
Okay, so this question is from Sunil Gera. Do all these roles, I think the 6 roles that we had discussed right some time back, so do all these roles report to the sourcing manager, or are they all peers?
So most of them are peers. So basically, all these roles report into me. But of course, you have certain lines in between. But ultimately, they all report into me, and they actually are peers amongst each other. So there's no hierarchy between, like, a spend journey lead being more important than a sourcing manager or than a procurement value catalyst. They are all of the same relevance. And again, here, this notion of engine is very important. There's not one single part in an engine which is more important than another. If a spark plug does not work, or if a line which is putting the fuel into the combustion chamber is defaulted, then the engine does not work. So every part is as important and as critical in order to make that engine work. And you know, I think this is really also important to reiterate to the organizations, that there's this equality about where you stand and what you do.
Okay, So next question is from Ekaterina Samokvalova. So Ekaterina says, asks rather, what skills apart from analytics, if I got it right, have you hired because it wasn't possible to reskill the existing procurement personnel? And how long did it take until new hires operations? I think what she is, how long did it take until new hires were up and running, hit the ground, so to speak?
You know, the second part is quite quickly. You know, the people are once they are onboarded and once you bring them into the organization, you're talking about a couple of weeks for them to be fully operational into the newer environment. So that goes pretty quickly. On the first one, in terms of what type of competencies that you've hired, I mean, for example, what one of the areas, again, sustainability being a very important one for us as our strategy, is there we are hiring non-traditional procurement profiles. I mean, sometimes people with more of a technical background who are more skilled from for example, legal point of view to understand all the changes in legislation of what is going on. People coming from a non-profit point of view who have a totally different understanding about how the organization works. We've also invested a lot, for example, in project management. Now, you could argue project management is a skill that you can deliver, and yes, you can. But what we also see is that if you really want to go into product development, you need to have a different types of mindset. You need to have people who have experience between moving a product and gathering all the input and really building a product. That's something different than just managing a project. So those are a number of the different activities or people that we have hired. We've also hired, for example, more specialists in terms of technology. Again, we have more and more applications that we are running within the organization, which also requires that you need to hire more GKUs, so global key users for these different applications. And those tend to be also different types of profiles, which you do not hire necessarily internally, but people who have programming skills or people who are capable of running these program implementations from a technology point of view. So then more IT type of profiles.
Okay, so next question is from Nick Forrester. You mentioned bottom line delivery, which is a traditional measure, but in a current hyperinflationary environment, how has your flexible model adapted to account for a transition from cost savings to cost avoidance?
Yeah, I mean, this is again the same thing. You know, today, let's just take a step back. First of all, inflation is something that is hitting us across the board. It's something that we were expecting for a long time to happen. I mean, if you look mid of next year or mid of last year already, we were anticipating inflation. And this also allows you then again to reallocate or regroup your organization in order to say, okay, let's now have certain types of teams focusing purely on these inflationary topics. And for example, from a direct material point of view, understanding what are the exposures that we are having. So for example, we have now a group which has been formed to really deal with everything related to inflation. And so this is something that we formed now, which might be dissolved again in a couple of months when we have passed that threshold. And so what we then do is we group that, or we staff that group with experts from direct side, from indirect side. I mean, whether it's travel or whether it's people working on contractors. We have people from the value catalysts who are providing market research, data type of competencies. And this is being led by a program manager on top, who is also working on the risk side. So this is how we then staff and regroup the team to really focus on an issue to deal with at this point in time. And once that will be dealt with, that team will dissolve again and will have to be reactivated. I mean, a similar example was around supply chain challenges. So we had a team which we formed to deal with supply chain challenges at the start of the pandemic. as the pandemic entered into more of an endemic phase, that team was dissolved. But in a week's time, it was reactivated again when we had the crisis in Ukraine. And so this is something which allows us this flexibility. We can create these agile pods that are dedicated around a specific theme, and that will, once that theme is resolved or comes to an end, that pod will dissolve again and flow back into the organization and work again on other types of activities.
Okay, I know your secretary informed me that you have another call at like 5 minutes from now, Sebastien. So maybe one last question we will take before we close it out. Okay, so this, I think this question, I think it's kind of close to your heart, Sebastien. So this is from Daniel Douglas. Can you elaborate on some of the different ways you can create a strategic bridge between business and procurement beyond working together on category strategies?
So again here, let's take the example of a consultancy company. What a consultancy company does is, or they appoint what they call a client service partner, and this is the similar kind of notion that we have from a business partnering point of view, and this goes beyond one category. I mean, if you think about it, if I sit down with let's say my commercial folks, they don't think categories. I mean, they don't think, oh, now I have a need that needs to be addressed by market research category or by the marketing category, but they will have a specific problem for which a solution needs to be found. And we can help, as again, like I said, we have a service offering that we can deliver, and we can plug and play as to how can we overcome some of these challenges that the business is facing with services that we can provide them. And again, it can be, let's say, for example, on market research, or it can be on insights, or it can be through connecting them with suppliers in the market who can solve their solution, or to organize, for example, supplier-enabled innovation sessions specifically on that challenge. But it's really the role of that business partner is to have a holistic understanding about the challenges that business face, and not think about categories or sourcing activities, but more things like the business, and has an open-minded, and then can make that connection to what or to how procurement can support in that challenge, and really to then also I mean, create the right team that can support the business with that particular challenge. And that can be a combination of, yes, category managers that need to support on specific activities. It can be sourcing managers that need to support on specific activities, but it can be something totally different that the team can do. And so this client service partner really or this business partner really needs to think as somebody who understands the problem, and then can connect it with the right solution that procurement can deliver. And the right solution, like I said, goes beyond purely category management or, for example, sourcing.
Okay, Sebastien, thank you so much, Sebastien. That was a very informative session on how to maximize value delivery beyond savings. We received several more interesting questions, but unfortunately we're out of time, and Sebastien has to log on to another meeting in a minute or so. I will ship all these unanswered questions to Sebastien, and if possible, and if he finds time, maybe he may answer one or two. And if he does, I promise I will ship them all out to you. So this marks the end of our session. A big thank you to all the participants for logging in today, and we will be sharing the webinar recording with all of our participants soon. Please do reach out to the email address on the screen. If you have any additional questions, as I said, I will ship it out to Sebastien, and if he has time, he will respond to it. Thank you, and have a good day. And to all those in Asia, good night.
Thank you so much, Shakti, and thank you everybody for joining into this session.
Thank you. Bye-bye.